Alexei, what do you think? Yeah, we wanted to talk more about military, but we still have to talk about politics because they're too intertwined. And Arty is talking about a good element that we need to increase our potential to make sure that we can counter Russian plan for the next summer, and that's rather calculable. An effort to make a good position for negotiations for the hot phase of American elections to affect the flow of this war. Here we have a cadre potential, right? That definitely is one of the key moments. So a question is, where's the root of evil in our current cadre policy in the Ukrainian military? I looked into this topic when I was the advisor in the president's office, and there were more people on that team, and we're looking for capability. How can we improve that? There are about 200 positions of generals that are being appointed by a president. And general is always a political decision. It's always a presidential decision, and it's a political decision. Where he will be fighting is also a political decision. So Zaluzhny is in a difficult situation here. So first of all, he is subordinate to the superior commander-in-chief, so he has to follow Zelensky's orders. And here is a good question of the dynamics between military as an institute and relations between Zelensky and Zaluzhny and that institute. Unfortunately, they are very murky. Up until today, I'm still not fully aware of where the limits of Zaluzhny's authority is in regards to appointing generals. But I can tell that it's rather limited. I don't know the exact limits because, first of all, I know that generals are being appointed by president. Commanders on the directions can be appointed by Zaluzhny, but under big influence of the office. But we can follow formal indications that we have. So first of all, the law that would delineate responsibilities, it's in the Congress, still not adopted for 2 years already. I pushed the Congress to adopt it even before the war, and I'm still bringing up this question. Because out of about 100 legal documents that we have, then position of commander-in-chief is only mentioned in 2. So it's about, 2% of the whole legal mass that mentions him. So from the legal standpoint of Ukraine, he has almost zero responsibilities, and they're very poorly defined. So every time he has to work with his own authority. While if he loses, we all lose, right? This is a very weak story. Why are we not providing him with the proper tool set? Nothing is written out. How does he react and interact with Minister of Defense, with other ministries? Just on the basis of a very simple formal sign, the delineation of responsibilities, it indicates that we are very unsuccessful in our military political strategy. Where is Congress? Where is the office of the president in this? Why the law is still not taken? Rhetorical questions, right? Now, the roots of the low KPIs in our military that we want to, they start with the head. So they start with the norms not being properly implemented and defined. And as we go deeper, for example, we can see cases when the commander of special forces, Kharenko, was fired without Zaluzhny even knowing about it. So that's the jump over Zaluzhny's head. And Arty, as a cadre officer, he knows that unity of command is the only thing that makes an army different from just an armed group of people, regardless of what arms you have. But you stop being just a crowd and you turn from a crowd or from an armed group into an armed forces or into an army when you have unity of command. Because that's the basis of cadre politics, because commander is responsible fully for all his subordinates. And at any single moment, every single serviceman has to have only one commander. And that's where you build a whole chain from a person in a trench, from a commander of a tank, from commander of a platoon, all the way up, because everybody knows who's in charge of what. And here's the Achilles heel of our army. Since 2014, we're being managed in the army. Instead of orders, we're being commanded by preliminary orders or dispatches. And I asked my friends who are fighting on the front line, several, how many actual orders have they heard? The answer was 0. What's the difference? The difference is that after you give an order, that's when a judicial responsibility comes in force. Because if you fail to execute an order, there'll be an investigation. Why did you fail? And commander also cannot give an order without providing enough resources to execute the order on the material, on the cadre, on logistics and food and everything. Right? So if he can provide for all that he can give this order. And usually the orders are being segregated into preliminary and the actual orders. And preliminary ones are being given before the actual goal is set, official goal is set for the military. That goal is, for example, is still being unclear or being formulated. That's when preliminary orders are being given. So my thought is that lack of clear goals in politics brings upon the lack of clear goals on the level of commanders. And the army is put by politicians in a position when they do not fully understand the terms and what for they're fighting for. And it's not only about the generals, it's also about the soldiers as well, if you go down the chain. So let's take a soldier who was recruited from some gym and sent to fight in Zaporozhye. He very often doesn't have a clear picture of what is he fighting for and what's the goal on his front. So going back to that caste of generals, why it exists and why do they allow themselves to behave like that? I think, and it's my statement, that they're a reflection of our society. Because since there are gray schemes in economy, right? There are gray schemes where people make money on areas that are poorly regulated. There are same gray niches in the army. It's a direct analogy. And there are clans of people in the army who exploit these gray niches. Some of them in the civil economy became billionaires and oligarchs, and the others in military became significant military rank commanders because they were exploiting these gray areas. Here's an example for you. 73%, I think, of our current army is ground operations forces. And 73% of recruits and materials and everything go through a commander of ground forces. I won't even bring up the last name right now, right? But where is he now? What is he doing now? Right? We're well aware he isn't. And we know that he has very good relations with Office of the President over Zaluzhny. And he is also an ex-commander of Zaluzhny. And according to the current and old laws of military, it's very difficult to command your previous commander. Because Zaluzhny, before his position, was just a command of the operative level, and Syrsky was a person above him. And when there is a lack of legal acts to define the authority of Zaluzhny, when president is destroying the principle of unity of command by reaching out over the head of Zaluzhny, like firing of Kharenka and bringing new generals there, and putting Zaluzhny in a situation when he cannot command 71% of the army, 7 soldiers out of 10, right? What efficiency can we talk about? And what do we want from our army that is actually somehow fighting on the front, right? This is a political question. And now let's try to bring it to the actual, now specifically about the fighting. 2 years of war, the biggest war in the 20th century, since Iran-Iraq War, since Second World War, the biggest war in Europe. And we are conducting our tactical warfare in a way, especially thanks to those dukes, so to say, that people who acquire military experience, who can transfer military experience, are very quickly leaving the ranks because they're wounded or killed. And this is the lower command level of sergeant or commander of a company. So when an infantryman gets to the field, he, doesn't have much of an example in front of him and the efficacy of being strong under fire, and they very often, when they do get some experience, they do not have time to transfer that. And the lower level commanders, sergeants, commanders of platoons, commanders of companies, these are the ones that transfer the main amount of experience and information onto the soldiers. And in the better countries of the world, the best specialists, lower level officers, non-commanding specialists are working as instructors in the training facilities. You need to be a very distinguished specialist to get into the training center as a coach, as a trainer in the American Army, for example. But in the other armies, like in Israel, for example, where the instructors are not the experienced officers and soldiers, these armies have certain issues on the battlefront. And we will be facing the same problem until we manage to get the best experts into the training facilities. And I think we can talk about that more. I think Arty might suggest more insights from the point of view of the officer who's actually active at the warfront. But I would say that from my point of view, besides overall military problems, what I try to show on the example of training centers and this training system that we have, I think also the big issue is the lack of transparency, corrupted, not really well defined in legislature. The commanding structure of Ukrainian military is also an issue, which is also a reflection of our society. And until that is optimized, we can perhaps expect some optimization by enhancing our military elements, but it will be limited. Because look, you can be effective when you can appoint your second in commands, gather your own team, and Arty is bringing an example up when the brigade commander basically made the whole brigade dysfunctional. This is true because a lot depends upon the commanding officer. He can either elevate his troop or he can pretty much destroy it. We have example when a new commanding officer would be bringing about 10 to 12 people with him, and out of a dead and barely functioning brigade, he would be making a very top of the top brigades in the front, very successful ones. But that's when they got an opportunity to appoint these figures. But note that on the higher level of military, they cannot appoint their second in commands. And that means they don't have enough efficacy. Same thing is happening with the ministers and different ministries in the civilian ones. You can come as a great expert, as a person with vision, but your second in commands are appointed by the system, which definitely lack your vision or lack your experience or just, sabotage your effort. How effective will you be? And this is one of the key questions that deserves being solved, because the system where general is appointed, but his second in command is somebody he cannot find a common language with, that indicates immediate inefficiency at the commanding level. And I can bring hundreds of examples from different branches of our military. I would not mention last names though, but I'm aware of them. That disorients and breaks a lot of work that can and should be happening properly, but instead doesn't, starting from training down to the use at the front. And there are a lot of examples like this, and I believe this is all a political question. If you right now bring the best of the best to fill your officers' positions, and basically from sergeants to top generals, the most experienced angels, so to say, maybe, and it's my point of view, the whole efficiency of the army will increase by 15% at most, because it's set in the environment when the cabinet of ministers and president are not providing proper support for them to conduct the warfighting effectively. And the need for political optimization is rather huge, actually. Arty, what about your reaction on this? All right, Alexei, thoughts laid out pretty clear. I cannot really retort to that in a negative way. But basically, it sounds like if Zaluzhny had good officers underneath him, everything would be better. And if he knew his powers, it would be better. Well, yeah, it probably would be better. And the fact that Butusov brought up that information into the public sphere, because we talked in the officers level in the military, but we haven't talked out loud about that. So he brought us to the public fashion that we have two commanders-in-chief, both Zaluzhny and Syrsky, that each of them are basically commanders-in-chief on their level. And they're old apparatchiks in my mind. They can outwards express the amicability and the fact that they have a sort of good communication, but in reality, they may have a lot of disagreements. And I'm a bit skeptical that if Zaluzhny had all freedom of power that he should have in the system with single authority, I don't think there'll be too many drastic changes, because I'm aware of not one, not two, but several key appointments that were actually Zaluzhny people, to whom I have a lot of questions about the quality of their command. And they're based. It's not that I don't like somebody's face, but they're really based in the actions, because the person failed in one position and then he is being appointed to another one to probably fail that area as well, I guess. And I suspect, of course, that's not the reason, but because Zaluzhny has good relations with that person, has good rapport, perhaps that is the factor. Zaluzhny has a character feature where he is trying to be friendly with most and be a good guy, generally speaking. But being a good guy, it's difficult to remove somebody whom you're in good relations with when you need to remove that person. And unfortunately, it sometimes leads to extra losses on the front because of the incompetence and inappropriate appointment of certain officers that were put in those positions by Zaluzhny. And we are aware down at the front who's protege. We know who's coming from Zaluzhny, who's coming from Syrsky. And I think the problem is that Zaluzhny is also still a part of that caste. He cannot really leave the framework of that caste psychologically. He was reporting that he fired 5 generals with satisfaction, but in my view, that number should have been a whole range higher, maybe even multiple of those. So I'm not sure that it would be much more effective if the principle of unity of command would be more enforced, and if we did not have two commanders-in-chief, basically. Or even if the office of the president would not interfere, because in my view, Zaluzhny is part of that system as well. There are some instruments that can negate these factors. For example, regardless how much you want to promote somebody to command position, if the candidate fails at the tests, that shows that his top is probably one of the commanders in a battalion or sub-commander of a battalion, you just shouldn't be able to appoint him. For example, from the Soviet practice, in the Soviet army, if the officer on the shooting range, and it wasn't a mystery, right? It wasn't being done individually. So if the whole division is shooting, if everybody sees that the officer is shooting maybe C minus, sometimes F, you would not appoint that person to lead the battery or division. His next position should be not related to the vertical artillery career. Regardless of his connections, he would probably go to logistics, to the head of certain support service, but not in his artillery stack, not the shooting position. So he can grow only at the non-shooting position, and that was physically impossible to put him there. So it worked in the Soviet system. There were objective evaluations of the qualities of the officer, which disallowed the inappropriate or unskilled people to take positions where they would fail dramatically. And you wouldn't get to a position of brigade commander or division commander if you're not a professional of the top level and if you don't have the top qualities. And in our army, in Ukraine, it happens so that the top commanding link of that artillery chain of command, they don't have the proper expert qualities, even in managing and directing fire. I'm not even talking about leadership skills and managing groups of people, having authority. And there are these criteria of evaluation. I have an insight that in our military, there is a group that is testing officers. And they took the method from one of the best armies of the world, and they're running that pilot project, and they're testing different officers on the front. I know an officer who got the highest point of all the 300 officers tested so far. Do you think he got promotion? I know officers who were at the captain position at the beginning of this war, at the captain rank, and because of them, they had certain models of command that were adopted in that brigade, because some basically lower command officer implemented the whole system using drones, using other systems that are now available, and defined a whole new system of working with these new assets. We did not have any regulations about use of drones. Our artillery rules were coming from 1983, right? No drones. There was no regulation about how to use them. So that young officer, because of his corps and his second in command, his other officers around him who help him, they create that system. They demonstrate that this system works and is very effective. They show it to their command, and as a result, several months later, the whole brigade is using that system. And then a month later, their neighbor brigade is using the same thing. And there are a lot of centers of growth like that. And unfortunately, all the initiators of that, those who created something important, something effective, due to which we're not losing the war now and even trying to win it, these people are unfortunately still on the captain's ranks. Some of them got promoted to majors, but very few. A small career step of half a step. And in reality, if you take the real testing system, and they should have gotten a huge career growth, right? And there are officers who have been commanders of brigade for in 20 years. When they were 20-something years old, they got promoted to brigade commanders. One of the most successful, the 3rd Storm Brigade, was just being developed, and there were opportunities. There are some examples when people get promoted according to their skills, but they're far and wide. There's no system to do that regularly. And that system of cadre that we have when everybody brings his own team, including Zaluzhny. And there are some people, I don't want to bring names because they're generals, but they're absolutely professionally inappropriate. They shouldn't be fighting. But they're a team of Zaluzhny, and they're sitting at their own positions and getting more promotions. And I'm absolutely sure if they're to take a special test, their ceiling would be not higher than the level of commander battalion. That's what we need to implement. And Arty, hang on. Let me interrupt you here. Let's give Alexei a word. He already mentioned a couple of things that he wanted to comment. I actually am in full agreement with Arty. And I'll bring a couple more examples just to follow up with his statement. When I was in the 18th, the aide in the intel to one of the brigade commanders on the front, I discovered that the linear detachment, the artillery intel and military intel, they're using different systems to even orient themselves on the front. Brigade is for the 3rd month on the front line, and they're still not unified. I almost fainted at that. And I tried to unite them into the same system, so they would use the same coordinates, the same structure. And we found the right commander of the battery who organized it exemplary fine and used her. By the way, the problem was she was a woman, so not too many people listened to her, but we tried to reinforce her knowledge. And she was the one who actually went there to measure everything and did everything proper. But it was nearly impossible to make the whole brigade, that intel service of that brigade, to fight in a proper way, the way it should be done. And each military officer can tell a lot of examples like that. So now going back to the office, before the war, we did some preparations, and that group that Arty is talking about was supposed to be testing people whom president is appointing in the system of security of Ukraine. It was a multi-step system, and the task was basically the final of this system would be winning over your contestants. You need to win the military game. That was the final selection. It was like a whole cycle of tests and games, military exercises, because you can win one exercise with some element of luck, but you needed to demonstrate it systemically that you are capable of doing it. That system was prepared, it was tested, it was put on the test table of the president to be signed in at least for the positions that president appoints in the military, and it wasn't. And now I have a question. Why, by the end of second year of war, it's still not implemented full scale? At first, yeah, I understand. We were running in the fire mode. We didn't have time or resource to test. We needed to defend ourselves. But now the war is of a planned character, right? It's a planned warfare since about July of 22. Why aren't we implementing that system now? This is definitely a question to politicians. That system of appointments, at least to generals' positions, to those that president appoints to directly. And I'm speaking publicly now, opening these cards. That system was prepared, was almost signed, was brought to the table of the president. That would resolve a ton of problems that Arty is talking about. And then you could implement it deeper down to the sergeant's level, that you follow a certain system of tests. Personnel specialist is leading, guiding you through, sending you to train. If there are certain areas where you lack in, but if you're capable overall, then you take more tests, and at the end of it, there's a series of commanders games. And if you continue proving that you can win over the similar contestants in the system, you get the position. We were preparing it for 9 months. We prepared and outlined every step there. It's fully ready to be implemented. Just like that law about delineation of responsibilities between superior command and commander-in-chief. Why the heck it is not signed in force? Right? Another rhetorical question. So Arty, with a lot of pleasure, I can say that I definitely am in agreement with you, and a lot of things of that you were talking about were done back in the 20. But big question, why it is not signed? I understand it's rhetorical, right? Right, one leads to another, because the quality of managing the troops, it stems from the culture. Now, majority of the commanding officers, they are, I would say, of a feudal model of a military, where human getting into this army is becoming basically a slave or indentured service member. There are some detachments where it doesn't exist, right? And it's not because it's a storm brigade or some logistics brigade, doesn't matter. There are examples of that indentured servitude in storm brigades and brigades on the front line and brigades defending positions or deep in the back in the trainings. And to the opposite, the same 3rd Storm Brigade, given that they have a rather stern vertical of command, the person doesn't feel themselves a slave. And in many others where commanders are basically feudal masters, that brings a lot of demoralization to the front. I know a lot of patriots who are eager to fight on the front with arms, but they don't want to go into the military because they understand real well where will they end up being, right? Alexei has a comment. Yeah, that's exactly my point about 2014. When I saw what they're doing near Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Mariupol, I said, I'll be acting on my own. I will not be part of that system. And for a year and a half, I was just working on the front as a part of a volunteer corps that I helped to organize, but not to be part of that bigger feudal system. At 2018, I went to check on my own what's the infantry in the front line, and I'll tell you that exactly everything that you're talking about, I will support 101%. Sorry to interject in your commentary. And in 2015, the volunteers were separated from the military. Somehow, political power understood that it would make sense to keep volunteers separately from the military structure. And that's when Volkors, so-called Dobrabats, appeared. Many of them were mechanized infantry. And there are different examples. Some of them were more covered in media, like IDAR, but that is not exactly the best example to bring up, I think, because in a surprising fashion, very often in those volunteer battalions, there were appointed people from System of Internal Affairs, from Avakov, from police, and they were interesting characters, sometimes a real mismatch. In military, it was a bit simpler because idiots just did not survive for too long. They either promoted themselves out of the front line or they were helped and removed from those positions. So military detachments usually were commanded by leaders, or at least by those who figured a way to coexist with less competent higher command. But they were still good leaders to manage their detachment. In 15th, many of the volunteers resigned. Some of them stayed on the contract, but then they already would have to start coexisting with the military system. And let's be frank here, after 2015, that military bureaucracy that was not appropriate for fighting the war, they spread their wings, and by 22nd, they already knew what risks would bring the volunteers when pouring into the army. So they did certain steps to make sure that new volunteers would be turned into that indentured servitude figures from the get-go. I actually witnessed one brigade that was being formed to grow to about the division size, and how the officers who were supposed to process the paperwork, process people joining that brigade, I cannot even describe the attitude of these officers and how they treated people. I had very bad feelings about that. So that system was ready for intake of volunteers at that moment. And look, the army before the full-scale warfare was about 350,000, now probably about 800,000. If you add another couple 100,000 who are now wounded and maybe healing, and that's a significant amount of new people. And most of them were volunteers. The first wave, for sure, 500, 600,000, they were not mobilized, who were forced or conscripted. Those were people who volunteered and came to the front to the nearest detachments of territorial defense or other brigades where they served before, back in the day. And these people were added to the ranks of our army. I think it tripled in size, roughly, because of this influx. And then next waves were supposed to be formed from those who did not want to go to the front, but who would still go to the front upon receiving a conscription notice. But what was happening in these military bands during the several years, during the couple years of the war, that led to people know what's going on. So there are not too many people willing to go there. Plus, there is a certain system now that, people walking around the city, taking young men, and I would say, I'll be blunt here again, if you have enough money to pay them off, you pay them off. Or maybe if you cannot do it at the spot, perhaps you can agree it on the level of local director of the conscription, or maybe on the medical level. So now there is a whole system of avoidance and how to work that and how to make money on the people being brought to the army. I don't even know how to break that system. I'm at a loss. How do we even normalize that process of mobilization? Given that reputation the army has in the society, and that it's basically a feudal type. Because where everything is good, you don't get much information. Everything is good, right? They don't get in the news. Nobody is writing and screaming and telling, how wonderful their commander is, how good the company is. Everything is just good. But in the places where people haven't seen the sauna for half a year and sitting in trenches and they get some very basic food with a lot of elements missing, or lack of water or some other things, And you also need maybe to actually cook your food to have some position to do that, and they don't. Right. So these people are loud. They're screaming, and it's on the level of the gypsy mail and post on Facebook and Telegram. And people are aware of these situations. Of course, Russian propaganda and Russian information is definitely peddling that problem. So how do we break it? It's difficult. I can roughly imagine how it should be done, but I can't imagine the conditions the stars that would align for that to happen. Okay, Arty, let's give Alexei a word. Right. We have, for example, 5th and 3rd storm brigades. Because of the great organizational talents of those people who lead them, they show a very high level of efficacy at the front. And even Azov, Prokopenko came back from being prisoner of war. They actually brought a lot more people to replace the old skeleton structure, but they're still showing good results, right? And there are good mobilized and good volunteers who are showing good results when everything is organized and they achieve pretty high levels. And the experience of 2015 is the experience of volunteers going into politics. Some of them got to our Congress, and that scared the ruling class, and many people from that group are refusing to repeat that experience. And now they're looking at the ratings of parties supporting Azov, and they're concerned about it. And it's a question how much military command is ready to make sure they gather those volunteers and make new detachments out of them, similar to Azov, that will be effective on the front and basically will not be part of that system. The second aspect is, I think, is key to understand is the destiny of 47th Brigade, which was on one hand a volunteer brigade, but it was an experiment of creating and adding a volunteer element to the military. So they took the better of the officers and volunteers, and that brigade went through a difficult and dramatic destiny. We see them near Avdiivka. They already are formed and they have experience, but that main sergeant who actually wanted to be a driver again, and that remember that element. And that tells you the story how the system grinds the talented ones down. And that attempt to mix the best that exists in military system with the best that exists in the volunteer system, and we should probably learn from that attempt. From an attempt to create a symbiotic or hybrid detachment. But if you look wider, this is one of the ways to optimize the system, right? This is the system of lessons learned that was instilled in American military for a long time. They tried to install it after the Vietnam War. And they eventually succeeded that not acknowledging your mistakes is actually a worse crime than when you acknowledge your failures. And when you have an army, when it is not a feudal system, when people can talk about their deficiencies and mistakes, knowing that they will not be punished for that, but actually probably will get support for coming out and acknowledging that. And we do have the group that now is trying to do the testing and implement and share that knowledge, but it is not a systematic thing yet. And lessons learned needs to become part of that system, needs to become part of the system of the cadre selection, of internal relations and politics in the military. And just that would increase the efficacy in our troops, I think, dramatically. So the questions of cadre policies are definitely crucial for our military. And that, when we get better cadre, what we could do, we could create more effective brigades similar to 3rd and 5th, separate storm brigades that demonstrate new ways of conducting warfare, new ways of organizing, create symbiotic detachments where volunteers and the better experience from military get mixed together, that they would become more detachments of that new style. And of course, there would be existing normal military detachments that would have a traditional style that just would need a lot of work to fix. So we would have basically three armies, so to say. First, for solving the most difficult tasks, second one for solving the second tier tasks, and then the third one that carry the brunt of the holding the front line and generally supporting the warfare. But they also will be going through evolution process with changing personnel policies and all. So I think right now we outlined one problem that can be optimized pretty much immediately, and is the radical change of personnel policies in our army. And regardless how we dance around it, we'll always come to the same issue, just as we did right now. Because you can give your officer 300,000 soldiers and 1,000 of FPV drones, they'll just waste them. If they're not trained well, if they're not in the right position. I don't know how much longer we'll talk, but I think overall change of personnel policies in military is a key element of our success if we are to achieve one. But it needs to be implemented from the top down. It needs to start with the commander-in-chief and going down to the level of sergeants. And the principles and the tests and all that need to be known to people. The problem is not that we don't know what to do. The problem is who will be doing that, right? Who will be implementing these changes? There are systems of deriving experience. There is a system how to promote your personnel. It all exists in the Western media, in the Western publications of Western successful, the best of the armies. And it was all summarized, reworked, prepared, and put on the table of our president. And I hope our conversation will bring this question up, and I know we're being listened to. The members of different Congress committees will listen to that, and society will listen to that. So I want to put the red line as the second head to that title. The key to this success on the front of Ukraine is change of personnel politics and policies. We need to get rid of those who are incapable and shouldn't be there. And this, I think, is the golden thing that we found during our conversation. Right. Thank you, Alexei. I think it's more of a conversation rather than a debate today. That I thought, well, right. I don't think there was much of a debating side because we generally agree. And sorry, Arty, let me finish that thought here. Some people are writing in chat, where are the debates? Well, it's difficult to really debate when we have complementary positions. When we both see the same laws of nature, essentially, you can see the reason and cause and consequence. Same thing in military. These laws are objective. The situation is objective and it's visible. And it's really the matter of how we use it, and the ways to use it are pretty obvious for officers. They wouldn't be a full-blooded debate today because we both see the logic, we know the reasons of these pains, and we suggest similar ways to resolve it. I think then that the value of this conversation is that you really outlined in a calm way all these deficiencies, and you outlined the weak moments and what can be done to resolve that. I think society needs to understand that. Arty, it's your mic, and then we'll wrap it up. Right, where we started. That's what I don't think, unwrapped well. I was at a certain stage a proponent of, or I thought a more optimal way to hold the front would be to hold the positions, so to say, the borders of the 23rd of February of 2022. If we just throw them beyond those borders, everything will be fine. Then there was an illusion that our allies are eager to support us all the way to the borders of 91. As time showed, it was an illusion. But now I have a big question. Some things are happening behind the closed doors. Somebody somewhere agrees about something, and our task, where we're going, the strategy of our war, needs to be formed by people who have access to that information, who have an open and frank conversation with our allies, who understand what can we expect. And I have a feeling that right now we don't have this communication. We don't have an open position of our allies. We understand there are a lot of them, so they need to be somehow grouped, corralled together to understand the totality of their support. And our vision of the end of war is not formed, and this definitely is a political question. This is a question to political leadership of the country. I would tell you, and I haven't paid much attention to our politicians, including the ones who are too close to President, Yermak and Arachamia, but here I made an exception and I listened to their speeches for an hour, even more than an hour, on one of the channels, just to form my own understanding of who these people are and what are our chances of getting these change. And I'm very disappointed. My confidence in a more positive scenario rather than negative, or one of the non-positive scenarios, unfortunately, my confidence is dropped. I do not see a probability for our political leadership, or capability rather, to speak openly with the West. They seem to be speaking on a different language. I know a bit of Brits and Americans. I had partners in my business, and I suspect they will not find common language because there will not be enough openness. We will not be frank enough with each other, and we'll be living with blurred strategic tasks, and everybody will be just trying to achieve the max on their part of the front. Do what you can and let it be what it be. Alexei? Yeah, a couple of words, really. As a country, we cannot formulate positive goals of this war. We only formulate the negative to get rid of Russian invasion, right? We can get back to zero, but there are no positive goals formulated. And they're different. I don't want to open a whole new discussion now, but this is our main strategic weakness, inability to formulate positive goals. And negative goals, they're not too good inspiring people. Perhaps you can go as a volunteer to prevent your country from falling, but the lack of positive goals would not allow us to take a person from the street who doesn't want to fight this war and turn them into the fighter who will be able to resist Wagner and to fight with the best of what Russians can throw at us successfully. Without positive goals, you cannot do that. If we find a way to, then everything will be all right. But we still have that main weakness on the political system. That's political weakness, that we cannot formulate them. And the second replic is that the West is also not in a good condition. I'm in the United States not for no reason. I'm here and I want to stay here until the voting is done for our financial aid to Ukraine. I definitely agree that we do not know how to talk to our allies. Our government needs to put a calculator on the table and start calculating mutual benefits, and they don't. And second is that the main question, the main category in the West is utilitarianism, how useful things are. And we're not talking to that. And also our allies are somewhat in a state of civil war themselves. What's happening between Democrats and Republicans in the United States is basically cold civil warfare. And it's a lot of religious context being used there as well, words like Satan, etc. So the task is difficult. These are my 2 cents here. All right, let's put a period here. Thank you, friends, for such, I think, a deep discussion on the military topic. Let's support military. Alexei will have a fundraiser for 1 brigade under his video. I think they asked for 300,000 and we already have only a third left. And under my video, I'll have a fundraiser for 58th brigade. There's probably another 100,000 left. Guys are raising money for an SUV for medical transportation. Thank you, Arty Green. Thank you, Alexey Arestovich, for your participation in that stream. Everybody have a good evening. Do not forget to click subscribe, like, and share, and donate to support Ukrainian military. This is the future of our country. And this is an opportunity for us to resist and stand in this difficult fight that we're now doing. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you, guys.